Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to get started with our second panel, the role of decentralized identities in shaping our digital world. Our moderator today is Mark Cachia again, the Chief Investment Officer from Scytale. Speakers Ingo Rübe, founder of KILT, CEO of both labs. Braxton Woodham, co-creator of DSNP, president of Amplica Labs. And Micha Bitterli, head of managed services at Deloitte.
Thank you very, very much, Sean. And thank you to our distinguished panel for joining us today, each tackling decentralized identity from a different angle. So let's maybe start with Ingo, who's the founder of KILT Protocol, former CTO of Border Communication, who's building KILT Protocol, which provides the infrastructure for others to give attestations and credentials that individuals, companies, and devices can use online to interact with others. Maybe say a few words about the inspiration and the need for digital ID and KILT's role.
Yeah, so I think we heard that in the fireside chat already. So DIDs, Decentralized Identifiers, are really crucial and important. And decentralized identity, I think, is something that is one of the major concepts in Web3. So you can't actually think Web3 without DIDs and verifiable credentials and without decentralized identity. And the reason for that is that we have an identity system in the physical world, which is actually working quite good. It is centered around the individual, because all individuals have certain identifiers like your face, your fingerprint, your DNA, as we heard, but also your signature. And those things are self-sovereign in a way because they belong to you. They never were made by somebody else. It's just your face. It's not given to you by your government or a company or something. So it's yours, and you decide what to do with it. And you also have the right to do what, not only the right one to do with it, but there's also nobody who can switch it off. And that is really important. So it is yours. It is decentralized. Everyone has their own. No better way to decentralize. But this is not identity as a whole. This is identifying. So if you want to make identity out of it, you have to add something like, we call it verifiable credentials. And in the physical world, that is your driver's license, your passport, your fishing license, your university degree and stuff like that. And also these things are decentralized because they are with you, right? They are in your wallet. And this is important because then you can use them for whatever you want. And the issuer, which might be the fishing club, but maybe also the government, they don't have the right to look into how you use it for, what you use it for. So it gives you privacy. And this function, which we had in the physical world, is totally misrepresented in the digital world. In the digital world, you basically have your Facebook ID, and that is centralized and does not belong to you. And it's basically very, very dangerous. And it's becoming more dangerous in the future. And this is why we need to break this up and bring the features which we had in the physical world, at least those, back into the digital world. And this is what DIDs and verifiable credentials are about. KILT, the project I work for, is an implementation of those, so that people can start building applications, like, for example, Deloitte does. They can use this and build application on it and make business models on top of that. That was also a question which we had in the first in the first fireside chat. Where's the business model? I think
so. Maybe we'll have
probably elaborate on that a bit.
To Micha now. So Micha is at Deloitte. At which division?
Consulting Zurich.
And he's responsible for KYX, which is
I'm responsible for KYC part, but also that is moving more and more, right? It's we have different regulations coming down the road. It's not only knowing your supplier, it's also knowing your supplier's supplier, knowing your client's client. You need to be able to control the entire value chain of a company. Now that's why we moved from KYC to KYX, which is a huge project we're working on, mainly the cargo industry.
And KYX stands for
Know Your X.
Know Your X.
Can be
That's
which is good.
I don't have any ex. I'm still happily married.
No,
My wife's over here.
no, X stands for clients, provider, supplier, and so on, right? It's just saying that it's not a classical KYC. It is now much more widen in the network what you need to see.
And this is a viable business?
At the KYX business,
Yes.
so that's something which comes now up. At the KYC business, yes, there is a lot of investments by classic companies. It's a lot is replicated. So I think there's a lot of streamlining KYC and confirmations, and that comes together with digital identity, right? Because you can centralize that while having it decentralized and with the client again.
And that is a monetizable business?
We will see. No, I think for sure it will be, right? Because it's a little bit the question of chicken and egg, right? Because I think digital identity has two sides, right? The one is that I own the data and I can share the data and decide where to share the data, and the other is the usage of data, right? Once I've shared, what can people do with the data? And if you see that in the classic Web 2 business, right? If you're a bank or you have a shop or whatever, you have a lot of limitations what you can do with data you gather. I mean, in Switzerland, it's forbidden to collect structural data, right? The digital world, once shared, forever shared, right? And then it's just used. So I think that's a little bit the issue is, if you give a credential out to a person, a digital ID, if I give you a passport, it's clear, you pay for your passport, right? If you're in a digital world, it seems to be different because people expect this for free, right? So the question is, who pays for it at the end? Is it the shop you're using it? Is it the person using it? And I think that's a little bit the decision which will come down the road. We currently go the way that the person themselves need to pay for it because we see it as a kind of a digital passport, right? And it's your data. But I think we need to work on both sides. We need to work on giving the people the data, right? And they can use it globally, which is a difference to a electronic identity, which is currently mostly local in countries. And you can only verify them if you're in the country itself, right? We have something on a digital, on a global level, but also you need to restrict the usage of data. And it's always, and that's what Ingo quite nicely does, right? He always does the comparison to the physical world, from the physical world to the digital world. And we do a lot in the digital world, which we would say in the physical world would be insane, right? If you go and you buy milk, and they say, yeah, I can have milk, but first please fill in this form and tell me your first name, last name, your date of birth, and whatever, you would say you're crazy. Why you wanted that? Yeah, I want to sell your data. I say, sure. But in the digital world, we do that exactly every day, right? I think that's something we also need to change.
Thank you. So, Braxton, I would view you as being in the middle. So you're building the infrastructure, but actually with the plan to go to direct to consumer for use. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit about Amplica Labs, maybe Project Liberty, DSNP, and the vision and the current status.
Sure. So, this thing on? I think it works. We've been following prior to our development the space where Ingo lives with great interest. So, DID, self-sovereign ID, and one of the insights we had was that your identity really is comes into existence when you interact with other humans. So, if any of you have ever just been alone in the woods, I was in the Pyrenees a couple of years ago thinking, you're just like, if you're alone, you're just kind of an animal roaming the earth. You don't really have an identity any more than any other animal that lopes by in the woods might. But when you come back into civilization, you do. Why is that? Because it's your proximity to other humans and the role you play in different contexts that really create your identity. And so what we designed was basically building on top of the systems that KILT and others are building, and the idea is to plug those into the network of all humanity, into the what we call the social graph. We call these identities social identities. They can change depending on context. They're very mutable and very composable to sit on top of digital identities. That's kind of our approach. And one last thing, I guess, is the stack you asked about, just so people know. All of that we thought of in service of how to make the digital world work better for humanity. And Project Liberty is kind of the why we're doing what we're doing. Started as a nonprofit, a big part of it still is. Our Biggest Fight, that book that you just heard Michael Casey talking about, that he wrote with Frank, probably the best way to understand Project Liberty is to read that book.
Or listen to it like I did.
Or listen to it. Yeah.
But then you have to listen to a Boston accent. So for people from Brooklyn,
That's true.
it's like,
That is a good, fair point.
So we think of the why, what, how. The why is Project Liberty. And then our group at Labs, we work in service of that. And then we work in service of two specific organizations. The what of Project Liberty is DSMP, which is this protocol for connecting all of humans outside of big tech platforms. And then the how is Frequency, which is a particular parachain that allows people to actually get social liquidity, we call it, via frequency.
and how would that be applied to, say, a social network? How does it work?
Well, our fundamental question on the design of this when we got our engineers together back 4 years ago was, what if the entire internet was the social network? So if you think about the history of the internet, and we've been fortunate to work with a lot of the key architects, these different eras. The first 30 years, you were really focused on a protocol stack, TCP/IP, which connected the world's computers. And then with the advent of HTTP, you then have all the data linked on those computers. And we believe there should be a third era where you link all the humans that actually create and consume all of that data and run all those computers. And so that's the way we think about the social network. And then we think that will unleash a huge amount of innovation and value on top when you move the network effects out of these balkanized platforms and into the core internet itself and make it available to anybody. Because if you look at big tech and follow the thread on their concentration of power, it is the network effects. The network effects tie to people, and the people are represented in databases, and that's kind of how it all ties together.
Thanks. So maybe I'll swing back to Ingo on items like actually generating adoption for DIDs. What have been some of the brightest spots, and then maybe some of the challenges?
So, hello. We share that. So I think when it comes to adoption, the most important thing about DIDs and verifiable credentials and digital identity or decentralized identity as a whole is actually standardization. That sounds a little bit boring, but if you're from business, you can probably very easily understand that. So if I come as Ingo and say, now I have a great idea how to decentralize your identity, here's my computer program, protocol, whatever, then you will probably not use that because it is just me, right? So the first thing that you have to do is you have to bring basically the world together and agree on how does that actually look to achieve compatibility and to achieve the possibility that there will be many, many implementations of it and not just one company which can go bankrupt or whatnot or go crazy and do something really bad. So this is exactly what happened. So in 2017, the Decentralized Identity Foundation was founded, and it has now more than 350 companies and governments which are part of it. Facebook and Google are not part of it for some reason, because they don't like the decentralization part of it. But all the others basically say, okay, when Google and Facebook own the identity of the users today, and we want to change the world to make it a better place or a more fair place, even for businesses, then we have to team up and discuss how digital identity should actually look like. And that has happened from 2017 to 2022. In 2022, decentralized identifiers and verifiable credentials were standardized by the W3C. So now we have a standard. And what we see since then is that governments, big companies, and so on come and adopt that. So the US, for example, which is quite a big country, they announced last year that they are going to hand over DID passports, decentralized passports, to every citizen in 2025, which is already next year. We're currently discussing with a project which is very close to the Republic of Indonesia. They're planning the same thing. So really big companies. They have more than 300 million citizens, right? So that's also a big country. So the countries recognize that, and they start investing in this technology and using this technology because they know there's a standardization behind it, and you can trust in the implementation, and you don't get locked into one company or so. And this is probably the same reason why Deloitte also goes and uses KILT, for example, because this is standard conform. We are doing standard conform things. You are not locked out of something or locked into something crazy. You do what the world does. Of course, this standardization could go, if this adoption could go much faster if it would be I'm choosing, but I'm not. So, of course, governments take a while to make decisions, implementations take ages, and so on. But we can probably say very clearly that in 2030, everyone here will have a DID, and they will have verifiable credentials, which are issued by the government, which are your passports. So this standardization is not stoppable anymore. So, and that is a good news.
Does anybody want to comment more on that? Standardization and adoption?
I mean, standardization is important. So you have a global use case, right? But at the end, we still live in a world which is fragmented into countries, right? So when you actually use it, you will use it somewhere which has local restrictions, right? Standardization is just important for the leverage, right? That's why for us it's important that it's standardized, that you can use it everywhere. I think that's also an issue we currently see a little bit with e-identities. They're not always standardized. So that's good for us because we would love to read EIDs and then put a global ID on top of it, which you can use everywhere, because it sounds somewhat silly that you do an electronic ID, which is a DID, and you can only use it in the country where it's issued, right? It contradicts a little bit with the idea of digital.
Right, where there are no physical borders. So Braxton, I presume you're mostly focusing on the US market to start with because it's a huge market and that's where you're based. Is it a part of the plan, or is it an early part of the plan to look at international norms, or are you really just looking at the US?
Oh, we definitely are looking at our project as global. Our first partner that implemented DSCP over frequency is MiWi, and they're about 50% of their user base is in the US, but another quarter is in Europe, another quarter is in APAC. So we really liked partnering with them for that reason. And their fastest growth right now happens to be in APAC. So we do look at this globally. I mean, the news you referenced earlier obviously is US based. That was in a lot of ways that we look for opportunities anywhere to really drive migration. Back to the American project, we look at the migration to this new Web3 world, very much like that migration, back in the early years of the United States, of kind of people escaping oppression and going to a place with more freedom. So we're looking for communities at scale that can migrate to Web3 en masse. That's kind of our focus.
So this is, for me, a difficult question, because there's such convenience now, just logging in with Google, logging in with Facebook, which ostensibly are free or don't cost you anything directly, but probably costs a lot in a hidden way. Like, how do we get people over the hurdle? How do we make it attractive for them to use DIDs that are self-sovereign rather than given by these corporations?
Well, sorry to jump in, but we've been working on this problem a lot. If you look at MiWi again, is one app, they have a login button now that looks a lot like what you see with Google, with Facebook, with Apple, but it's frequency. And the idea there is that it's a self-sovereign ID that you the individual own, and you can plug in any self-sovereign ID system is our vision. So we're hoping to have KILT as one of those options in the future. We've been deep in talks, I know, Ingo, with you about that. And we have a lightweight system we put in ourselves, but that's not our main focus. And the idea is every app would have this button, and you would be able to go around, and unlike Apple or Google, you would have control over what parts of your identity and your digital kind of life you expose to these apps. and you can, instead of Apple owning your identity or Google, you own your identity, and you can delegate and revoke access to applications and platforms on the internet, which is really the way it should be, but it's a massive paradigm shift from today.
Yeah, I think it's also not, so there's no one, the standard does not say it has to be complicated or unfriendly to the user, actually. So you can make it as you want it, right? You can make it password protected, you can make it fingerprint protected, whatever you want, right? So it's not unpractical. The implementations can be different. There can be totally complicated ones where first you have to write down 24 words and stuff like that. So that is also possible, and that is probably even more secure if you want it more secure. But of course, that the actual implementation has to adhere to what their specific user group wants. So if it's crypto people, then the 24 words are totally okay. If it's social media users, then it's probably login button, right? So that doesn't is not defined by the standard.
And Micha, where is Deloitte seeing demand coming from?
I think one is that's the big use case. That's the login feature, right? So to use your DID as a login, right? No more passwords. You just share your DID. And I think the important thing is that you don't share all the data which are in the credentials, and we just share the data which is relevant. So if you need to be above 18, the only information we shared is above 18, right? But it allows to track back with the DID. So if something would happen, that you still would need who would know who is it, right? So I think that gives a lot of advantages to use cases we have today. So you could trade at an exchange. You don't need to show who you are, right? But in the moment you misbehave, somebody could still see who was it in the backtrack from a regulatory perspective. I think that's also important that we consider regulations at the end, right? We see a lot of use cases in the space of fake news. So putting a DID on a document, on a picture, or whatever, to prove that it's actually done by a human being. I think it's also very important to do the other way around, so that you not only have DID for human beings, but also for bots. So you know which bot produced what kind of nonsense, right? And you can see something which doesn't have a DID is nonsense by default. Right, so that we can start to filter a little bit the data and come back to these to know what is truth, what is fake news, right? Well, now we live even in a world where we have real people sharing fake news. That's also a little bit interesting concept at the end. And I think, and that's where the role of Deloitte comes in, and I think that's where we can be important for society is this concept of a single source of truth. Right? Saying what information is truth, right? Once it is in the system, then we can, with technology measure and whatever, we can say, yes, this is the correct information. We can do that. The majority of nodes says whatever, right? But in the moment you put the information in, somebody needs to say, this is really Ingo, right? And that's where players like Deloitte can play an important role to say, this is a reality, this is truth, and not something else.
So that leads to two important concepts from my point of view. I'll start with the hard one first. What do you think the path will be? Because I'd love to have a KYB, right? So here's my credentials for a company, know your business, KYB, or even myself, but nobody accepts it yet. So what's the challenge to get different entities to accept this as a proof or a credential?
It needs to be a business case, right? So that's the chicken and egg question. You need a lot of users to be attractive for companies.
But how do you get users if they can't use it?
You see, that's the chicken and egg. No, the way we are doing is we work together now with an interesting project, Polymac, right? The guys are somewhere there in the background where you need a credential, which are the natural business cases. So we start more on the regulatory angle, where you say, okay, you need KYC, and that will come more and more, right? I mean, it's an illusion to think that in the future you can trade crypto without a proper KYC, right? It will go more and more that the classic banking world and the crypto world, they will align at a certain point, right? So you need KYC, and we have a very attractive way to provide KYC and to reuse your credential, right? You can use it at multiple companies, and you don't need to redo your KYC all the time, right? It's an interesting business case. That's also a business case where people are prepared to pay something for it because it relieves from a certain burden. And this should allow to ramp up the number of users to a sizable number where you can start to switch it around, right? And do collaboration with other companies because you have a lot of credentials already out there. So you need a kind of a startup, right? So you can then leverage out.
So I was just going to add with the chicken and egg problem that if you look at the obvious examples in Web 2, it's pretty clear. You start with people, and then the monetization comes later. So that's kind of why we've taken the approach we have. So we now have over 800,000 people on chain right now that came over in a very low friction way, tokenless kind of wallet in quotes. We don't really want to call it a wallet, but they have API keys, and we're working on technologies that introduce them, ramp them into the world of tokens and ownership and more sophisticated KYC, et cetera. So I think a graduate like Ingo laid out, you can get people en masse with lower stakes, public spaces, and then the more private, more secure use cases can then roll out over time, and you can have increasing friction, but there's value behind that friction. So as you said, people will do that work if they're protecting real digital assets, et cetera. So that's our approach, and we're trying to do it people first, and then value kind of behind the people on the network.
I think those concepts are really, really important, and that goes in the same direction as governments. So if governments go and say, yeah, now everyone get their DID, and if companies like me with hundreds of thousands, millions of users actually say, we're going to migrate you to DIDs, and that happens on a great scale, and those things are then compatible. And then you will see the businesses growing because in the identity space, there is already business. There's billions and trillions being made because every credential that somebody gives you, you will pay for in some way or form. When you go to Deloitte and want a KYC, of course, you're going to pay for because they're making a KYC for you. That is just normal business, right? And why is their KYC valuable? It's because they have accumulated trust over the centuries. Or decades, don't know, and and they're basically monetizing this trust into their business model, and this is the business model of identity. It's actually pretty simple. Every university runs on it. The university is going to sell you a course, and then they're going to, if you pass the course, then they're going to give you a credential, and you can use that credential for getting a better job. Then that is the business, right? And it is huge, and you have to somehow start feeding on the people and actually making masses and lots of people who actually can use those credentials, and you need a DID for using those credentials. That's the first thing that you need. And if we can move forward with MIVI and frequency and that way, and also move forward with a couple of countries actually implementing that, then we have a user base which is big enough for businesses to actually go and say, hey, we are a university and we only give you certificates in the form of verifiable credentials in the future. This is then going to happen.
I mean, the main question is, what is a DID, right? I mean, when I talk about the DID, I talk about a passport, more or less, right? And it's not only information, it is also that the information is with you. So I also verify that Ingo is Ingo, right? I mean, it's easier business cases for sure, where you can say it's just a person just above 18, and you put that together with a number. And the question is just, how do you know that this person is above 18, right? So the question is the reliability of the information I put in these credentials is quite important for the use cases then at the end. I mean, why would you do a DID which just said I'm above 18, then you can stay with the click I'm above 18 on the website, which says nothing, right? I mean, my son is 12, he is honest enough that he doesn't click, but he could, right? So I think we talk about a DID, kind of a golden record of a person, which can be trusted also from a regulatory perspective. That's how we look at the DID in Deloitte, right? Then you can add a lot on this DID, which is your university degree and whatever, right? Which gives then a kind of your personality or social DID.
So a hot topic right now is proof of personhood. So to distinguish people from bots, from AI, that is would you say that's the lowest level of a DID, or it's not even a DID?
No, when I can say it's a credential. So we also, the DID is basically the face and the signature, which is something that is stored on your computer. You make it yourself, and no one is credentialing anything on top of that. That is just to sign things and to show actually that you are unique, right? That's the identifier part.
But it doesn't show you're a person, or it does?
No,
Because not
at all. Not at all. No, I think it's not good to do that at that level. And I think that also goes in the direction what we discussed before of the digital rights charter, or whatever you want to call that. We are not alone. There's also bots. There's also AIs. There's also machines. And we have to recognize that they are there. I make a simple example maybe from journalism. If you say you want to distinguish if an article was written by a person or by an AI, you can't do that today, because the person has most likely already used AI to write the article. So it is already already AI in there. So it doesn't really make a difference if it was written by a human or by an AI in the first place. We cannot get out of that. So we have to acknowledge that AIs are already there, and maybe they have even rights, or maybe robots have rights. We can discuss about that. But just saying that we distinguish between a human and a machine by not giving them a DID, that doesn't work, because DIDs are also working for machines. That is totally fine. And what I would see is that there should be a credential, so like a passport, saying you are human. And you can make a very simple test, or lots of very simple tests of actually finding out if somebody is human. So for example, you can make a KYC. That is also actually a proof of personhood that you can attach to something. You can also do that more often, and there's tons of nice concepts. So, but this is on the credential side. That's not on the identifier side, because we need to identify not only humans, we have to identify the others too. Otherwise, we will not end up in a good state.
I concur. We used to think about that, the polar ice cap thought experiment, which is, if you think about getting information in your news feed about the melting polar ice caps, where does that information come from besides the journalist who writes the article or the AI they use? The sensors have identity that sense the ice caps melting. Those sensors were placed there by scientists and technicians who have human identities, and you might want to trace that back. So we call that provenance. And so this chain of provenance is really important, and you definitely need a root of a noun, of identifier, and then the provenance can then, through credentials, tied to people or other objects as well, not to mention pets and cats and dogs.
I mean, at the end, the question is, do you have a trustful source, yes or no, right? Is it an AI? Is it a human being? Is Ingo using AI to do it? I mean, at the end, I'm interested that Ingo is publishing it, and I trust Ingo, right? And I think that's important, that we know who is issuing stuff, and so I can decide, is it trustworthy, yes or no? I wouldn't even go and say do the distinction between AI and natural persons. I wouldn't do that. There are a lot of natural persons which write a lot of rubbish. I would say there are other people who say that's all genius what they say, right? So I think it's still our responsibility to judge if an information makes sense or not. But I think we should avoid this spamming of news, lying and whatever with bots, which we currently have. So we need to be able to filter better the information to get it back to usable.
think you're right. It's about accountability in the end. So when we go back to the journalist example, a journalist, if he writes total bullshit, then he's probably sanctioned in some way by his boss. And if the boss lets it happen, then he's sanctioned by the government, by maybe the government, but most likely the company which is behind that. And in the end, is going to be the brand that suffers, and the brand is that thing that actually holds the trust. So in the end, it is always a trust relationship. And I would say it could also be AIs which build trust over the time, if we find a way to make them accountable for what they do. And for that, we need to identify them again. Yes. So we need identifiers, we need credentials for the AIs, so that the AI can say, yeah, see, 1 million people were happy with what I said, and I really make good research, and I can prove that I made good research, and so on. And I'm looking at different sources, and now you can start trusting me. And if the AI then at one day goes and says, no, I'm going to go radical into one direction, they will lose this trust, right? And will be sanctioned. But this is why we need the accountability of not only of persons, but also of AIs in the future.
I mean, yeah, you're totally right. I mean, at the end, it's about liability, right? So somebody needs to be liable if something happens. So if you have a bot which starts to drive share prices somewhere, right, and we have a huge loss somewhere, somebody needs to be liable for that. And that's a little bit the issue we have in the digital world, that you can do a lot without being liable. And there is a huge request to not being liable. I mean, people want to trade without giving their name and whatever, which you couldn't do in Web 2, right? So you have rights, but you also, there are still regulations, right? There's still a liability, and we need to be able to hold people liable at the end. And I think that's what's missing a little bit, or to a certain degree, that people can just spam information and do whatever, and nothing happens, right? And I think we need to, in all we do, is yes, we need to drive the digitalization. We need to make it easier for the user. It's still a little bit a clumsy experience and whatever, but we need, at the end, we need to map that into the real world. And the real world is not fully global and whatever. And in the real world, Ingo goes to prison if he does something wrong, right? And the same should happen also in the digital world.
Unfortunately, right now, the systems in place focus on engagement over accountability. And so that's what we're trying to change, is we're a world where there's a focus more on accountability that still could maintain engagement, but with accountability, which is sadly not happening right now at scale.
So speaking of prison and staying out of it, DeFi. So to my mind, an obvious massive use case for DIDs is to make DeFi users regulatorily compliant. That doesn't mean that they reveal who they are online, on chain. Everybody should have the ability or chance, right, to operate pseudonymously. But, you know, with Micha coming and a lot of the regulation out of the US against self-sovereign wallets and addresses, it's really only about the anonymity about the addresses, which people think, which I don't think is really going to be the case, certainly won't be the case long-term, and probably not even short-term, that they can avoid following the law and the regulation, like avoiding taxes and, you know, manipulating markets and all of this. And there are wonderful companies out there like Chainalysis, which has a very interesting Polkadot OpenGov. That's a different topic. Where are we? How close is it? I don't think it's close at all, but I think it should be, to engaging with DeFi protocols to make them regulatory compliant, that the founders and the runners of this are not seen as abetting activity that's against regulations. Is it anywhere?
I think we see the first example, and you mentioned it already. So the fundraising of crypto projects is one of those things which is not exactly DeFi, but which goes in that direction. And this is where we see things like the Polymer protocol, and the people are here, emerging. And I think yesterday they got their first funding request from another project in there. So now you can basically add yourself as an investor in those projects there, get your DID, KILT DID from Deloitte, so everyone's involved. And then you are in some way or form a regulated investor in that thing. So there's going to be tests about that if you could actually do that, and you can use the internet without going through a new KYC process and so on to actually invest in a nice and informed way into crypto projects. I think that is a first step. That's not yet the DeFi world, but if we allow those things and if we actually show the use cases for that, and then we show that I think there's 3 or 4 projects coming in the next 2 or 3 weeks which are going to raise their money over that platform. And if people then see, okay, this works, this is where actually money is in, they are probably more interested also from the DeFi protocols to get more into this world. Of course, today they're not so much interested because they try to avoid it as long as they can, which is absolutely natural. So if it works without regulations and if it works without KYCs, why would you go to your customers and say, let's be the first who's regulated? So
I think we're getting there, right? And it is the same as banks did 20 years ago, right? We tried to avoid, then regulations kicked in. You still tried to avoid. Then it started to get expensive. It was payable, so you tried to avoid, and then it got really expensive, and then they started to do it, right? And that's what we also see now in the DeFi space. I think Coinbase paid $160 million now, something around that, because of KYC, and that's forcing it, right? I mean, at the end, you need to ask yourself, what is the difference between a bank doing a trade and you can do that on a platform, right? And if it's not that different, why do I need, for an amount over 10,000, I need to prove where the money is from and do whatever, right? And on an exchange, I think I need a proper KYC from Deloitte when it's a transaction over 100 million, right? It's not really balanced, right? And I think that's what gets a little bit more equalized. If you open an account at Swissquote here in Switzerland, you need to be identified. If you have a wallet, you can do whatever. And it's somewhat, it also doesn't feel right that you have a very transparent technology, right? It is digital, which allows the most untransparent transactions. It would be easy to change this, right? And I think that's the reason why it also comes. But I think it needs to come over pain. And that's what we see increasing. We see increasing regulations. We see increasing penalties. And at the end, everybody wants to do business. So if it's more expensive to be non-compliant than compliant, then people become compliant. If it's more lucrative to be non-compliant, people will not be compliant. But that's what we currently now see coming up, right?
I think there's 3 elements too that technical elements that feed into this. That two are well known. DIDs being one, verified credentials. We mentioned both those. The other one is data minimism, which is in the analog world not so common, but in the digital world, it's a huge opportunity. So, for example, you don't need to know that I'm 48 or 52 or 65 to know I'm over 21. You could just have a token that just is verified by an authority that says I'm over 21, and I can enter certain spaces. Same thing could be true being an accredited investor, etc. So I think we're at the early stages of this. It's one of our core design principles is data minimism, but I think we'll see a lot more of that. That will then unlock more adoption because that will help balance authenticity and privacy, which is such a knife's edge for so many use cases that if you can allow people to actually do what they want to do, which requires authenticity around certain attributes, and have some level of anonymity or pseudo-anonymity, data minimism would accomplish that.
That's something we do as well, right? So you have a full data set, but you only share what you want to share, what you need to share. And I think that's also a requirement for European Union, right? GDPR and all this stuff, that you're able to do that. That's why we also follow that. But the problem still remains, how do you know if somebody is above 21 if you don't properly identify him? And for doing that, you need an ID. And an ID is not sufficient because I can also take the ID of Ingo right? It's actually very dangerous. We have seen concepts like that. Said how do you identify a person? Yeah, they scan the ID. Brilliant. So that means if somebody steals my ID, he can start to trade my name. Very nice. So you also need to prove that the person using it is actually the person owning the ID. I think the idea of what we do is you do that once, and then you can use it everywhere. And I think that's a big change. Currently, you need to do that recurring at multiple places. And I think also if you do it once and you can reuse it, then it's much easier for the business cases to use it at different levels, right? Because that's what we see also in politics, right? Is they also look for their own companies, how much does it cost? So if you have technology which enables stuff at not too high costs, then also the regulations are coming. And we will see that also. We will see that in a lot of industries coming where currently you just click, I'm above 18, because they say it's economically not reasonable to do that. I think with products like ours, it becomes economically reasonable, and that typically changes a lot in the regulations.
So that was a lot. That was 45 minutes of a lot of information. Are there any questions before? Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the very interesting conversation. It's fascinating. One thing that, Michael, you talked about earlier, which caught my attention, was the concept of toxic dependency, where, you use the example of the refugees who are trying to escape a government are relying on that same government to say who they are and to prove their identity. And as the conversation was unfolding, I was thinking about that. And, and the question in my mind is, how do we, with the concept of sort of this, decentralized identity and moving into the self sort of governance, how do we get around the problem where we don't sort of create a dependency on who's doing the identification? So if we have to rely on someone or an entity who is doing the identification, which we're using to as part of the decentralized identities, do we sort of create a dependency where we're sort of moving away from the Googles who are sort of controlling that data to the new entity who are the identifiers in the decentralized world? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing I'd say is, in this space where we live every day, there's always this issue of you're moving the problem around. So you solve it here and then it shows up somewhere else. And so I don't pretend to have any magic silver bullets that solve that, because we always, the human history is that, really moving the problem around in a lot of ways. That said, I think that having two things, having verifiable attributes that can be added and removed allows you to then move from one authority to the other and reduce dependency on one particular authority. So that's one thing we're saying is, one of our simple mottos was, would it be better if our social networks weren't controlled by one or two companies or platforms? Does it solve all the problems, but it's a step in the right direction? And the second thing is, for social identities, we think, back to Michael's example there in Syria, the idea of having a DID that you can plug or unplug into the graph in different contexts allows you to at least start over if you need to. And we think that hopefully we're in a world where that's a rare case, but it's a really critical case when it does come up. So you want to obviously always have that option to unplug and restart again somewhere else.
I think the solution will be that you have multiple providers doing the same at the end. And it's not that Deloitte, we don't create identities. We also rely on countries issuing IDs, issuing identities, right? In case of refugee, we would need to have an authority which is able to issue a kind of an identity which is not based on a country. I don't know if the United Nations could do that, for example. And then we would be happy to put a DID on top of it, but it's always on top. So if we, for whatever reason, would say we don't do that somebody else can step in. And there it's very important what Ingo said is standardization, so that the next provider coming in is using exactly the same format, then it doesn't hurt, right? Because you just switch from one to the other. And I'm convinced there will be multiple providers, because I don't think every service needs the same strength of trust You don't need a Deloitte DID for every service. If you just need to be above 18, potentially it's okay if another provider doing it a little bit cheaper proves that you're above 18, right? If you are more in the banking world, then it makes more sense that you have a trusted counterparty like us, right? So I don't think it will be this hard dependency because it's not that tech-based as it is currently, right? Because you're using Google, you're using Chrome, so you have to use more or less Google. There is no option. I think in the future you will have options, right? The question is, how do we get our logins into the Google universe, into the Facebook universe? So that will be the big move.
Oh, thank you to our esteemed panel. That was an amazing conversation. You guys are awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.